There are things that one only realizes after everything has already gone to hell. I should have noticed sooner. Perhaps I should have understood earlier that my mother wasn't the victim I always believed her to be. When I saw my wife punching my mother, my very first instinct was to kick her out because, for a split second, I didn't even see my wife there. I only saw violence. But it wasn't my wife I should have sent away that night. It should have been my mother. Unfortunately, the past influences us too much. It influences our choices and our actions, and my past was far from easy. On the contrary, I grew up in an extremely toxic environment. My father was the type of man who would storm in through the door of our house and command everyone to stop. Nobody dared speak, for if he was having a bad day, we already knew that things were about to go terribly wrong. He was like a mean, battle-hardened soldier, not literally, but in the way he conducted himself, as if the house were a battlefield and he were always on the offensive. Sometimes he would come home drunk and take out all his frustration on us. But even when he was sober, things were hardly any different. In fact, sometimes I'd say it was even worse. I remember once my brother got hit extremely hard in the face simply because he dropped a plate on the floor. And it wasn't just us. My mother also got beaten for trivial reasons. We lived in a constant state of tension whenever he was around. I remember the only time I ever tried to do something, the only time I attempted to stand up to him, was when I was about 9 years old. He was beating my mother. He looked possessed. He wouldn't stop hitting her. I truly believed that she was going to die right there, so I leaped at him in an effort to stop him. He grabbed me, shook me violently, and said that the only reason he didn't take my life then was because he didn't want to end up in jail. But if I ever did that again, he wouldn't go easy on me. I can't forget, even to this day, the force with which he shook me. I wish I could say that my memories are vague or confused, but they're not. I remember everything. The shouting, the sound of slapping, the breaking of objects, the cries of my mother. Everything is imprinted in my mind. My mother was hospitalized several times. My father always managed to slip away from the consequences. The police would come, but nothing would change. My mother never pressed charges. We never talked about it, but today I see it was all because of fear. Perhaps fear that if he returned home after a complaint, we would all pay the price. I don't know. All I know is that we never did anything. Sometimes my mother said she was going to leave, that she couldn't take it anymore, but she never did. Sometimes she said she would call the police, but she never did. And so we learned to survive. It only stopped when my father died. He suffered a fatal heart attack in the middle of the night, and I felt an enormous relief. I asked forgiveness from God if this sounds strange, but I hated my father. I had no good feelings for him at all. There wasn't a single moment of affection, not a single good memory. Finally, I could breathe without fear, though the damage had already been done. My mother wept so much over my father's death after years of abuse, after so much pain. She cried as if she had lost a great love. I never understood that part, and to this day I cannot fathom how she could still love a man who looked at her so disdainfully when she was so vulnerable and broken. I thought to myself, I need to take care of her now. I grew up very attached to my mother, almost to the point of suffocation. I didn't want her to be alone. Perhaps I felt guilty for not having been able to defend her. My siblings were different, not that they were bad people, but rather more selfish. I suppose they were old enough to go out and conquer the world. My sister began dating early, soon got a job, and made plans to leave home. My brother took the same path, following their lives without looking back. But I couldn't. I saw my mother there, fragile and alone, and I simply couldn't bear it. I told myself that she wouldn't be able to go on without me, that if I wasn't there, she would fall apart. So sometimes I would skip outings with friends just to stay home with her. I'd cancel plans, lie that I was tired or had too much to do, when in truth, I only didn't want her to be alone. She cried over everything, a commercial on TV, a sad song, a meal that reminded her of my father. Every time she cried, she said that everything was all right, that she no longer needed to be afraid, but she also said that it wasn't fear. It was the pain of missing him. Nowadays, I can't even stand to be around my own mother without thinking of all the beatings I received as a child. Before I knew it, I had spent years fostering her dependency on me. She would say that I was the man of the house now, that I was the son who would never abandon her. We had a very strong bond, and at least until then it wasn't toxic. My friends sometimes said I seemed like a fool for always being by my mother's side. They'd tease me relentlessly, saying I was too clingy, as if I had no life of my own. But I didn't care. All that mattered was that my mother was well, and the rest didn't matter. Yet, as I grew older, I began to realize that my mother had a way of making everything revolve around her. Of course, there comes a phase in life when one starts going out more, wanting to meet women and so on. And that phase, of course, arrived for me as well. I noticed that every time I said I was going out with my friends, my mother would get upset. She would say that it was lonely to have dinner alone or to watch TV by oneself. Though she also admitted that I was right, that I should indeed do what I wanted. And that's when it struck me. She never outright said, "I want you to stay home." No, she didn't say it directly, but she would insinuate it, gently nudging me to choose staying at home. And I would end up with that feeling as if I had to compensate for all she had suffered in the past, as if my presence was the only thing that prevented her from feeling lonely. So often I would choose to stay. Things began to change when I met my first girlfriend. I was truly excited. It was that wonderful phase at the beginning when everything seems perfect. We went out almost every day. We talked for hours. And yet, true to form, my mother managed to insert herself into it all. At first, I thought she was happy for me. She asked about the girl, even asked to see a picture, and even joked that I looked different, as if there was something new in my eyes. But then the small comments began. In the beginning, she said things like, "You shouldn't be out late at night," as if a proper lady wouldn't be on the streets that late. Or when I saw some picture of her that she herself had asked to show, she criticized the way she dressed, saying her clothes were too flashy and that a proper woman dressed differently, implying that my girlfriend was easy, though she never stated it directly. She never outright said she didn't want me to be with her, but she pointed out flaws that I couldn't even see, flaws that didn't exist. And since I always listened to everything she said, at that time, I ended up being influenced by her words. My mother was the most mature person in my life, the one who loved me the most, the only one who truly wanted what was best for me. So I believed everything she said. And as the years went by, she only got worse. I met someone. I fell in love. I began to build something new. And then my mother would come along with her precise comments, her subtle insinuations, and I would fall into them. And always, invariably, I ended up losing that relationship. My best friend George always used to say that my mother seemed like a manipulator. He'd said it since we were kids, but I would counter that my mother would never do such a thing maliciously, that she had suffered too much in life, and that she needed my company. Yet I was certain that one day I would find a woman who would please her, and that day truly came. I met someone new, and my mother adored her from the very beginning. She constantly showered her with compliments, always saying that she was a polite, gentle, and perfect woman for me. I was overjoyed. After so many relationships that my mother had rejected, after all the venomous comments she'd made about every woman I dated, at last here was someone she truly approved of, someone she genuinely liked. I remember telling Need about it, joking that since I'd started dating, my mother had never accepted a single woman in my life. I said it with a smile, as a way for us to have a laugh. No criticism aimed at my mother. Need would smile and say that she felt flattered, that it was a privilege to be held in such high regard by my mother since she was so demanding. My mother was very friendly, and indeed she was. She even started inviting Need over to our house, something that had never happened before. She would call her for lunch or dinner. There was a good rapport between them. Sometimes they would chat about trivial things, compare notes, and I would watch, delighted, as my mother and my new love got along so well. In those days, at least, it made sense to think that my mother's approval was something special, for Need was truly unlike anyone I had ever met. I loved that woman dearly, yet not everything was perfect. Need's family did not like me very much. Her stepfather, in particular, was never very kind to me. He never directly said that he didn't want me around, but his cold indifference was unmistakable. Perhaps he thought that I wasn't a real man, that I wasn't strong enough to take care of Need. Who knows what people think? I was never one to be a fighter, neither in character nor in physical strength. Perhaps he could see that in me, that I was fragile. Need once told me that her stepfather was extremely strict. Not that he ever hit her, but he was the kind of man who liked to be in charge and maintain respect within the home. He was extremely severe. She told me she was desperate to leave home and live with me because they argued constantly. He disapproved of everything, and nothing he did was ever good enough. Our shared backgrounds, both having grown up in somewhat troubled households, brought us even closer together. As the months passed, our relationship blossomed into something spectacular. I couldn't have asked for a better gift from God. Need cared for me with such tenderness and dedication. She kept repeating that she couldn't wait for the day we'd get married and have a home that was just ours. In time, that idea began to take root within me as well. I started thinking about proposing, and I discussed it with my mother, assuming she would be happy for me since she had always said Need was the perfect woman for me. To my surprise, however, she did not approve. She said we were still too young, that marriage was a serious matter that shouldn't be rushed, that it was better to wait a little longer until we were more financially stable. I was already working and earning a decent salary, so I didn't see any reason to wait. But on the other hand, Need was still studying. She was in her final year of college, so it made sense to at least wait until she graduated, and that's how it should have been. Until a small twist of fate occurred, Need became pregnant. The pregnancy changed everything. Need's stepfather would not tolerate that she have a child out of wedlock, so we had to get married in a rush. My mother was very nervous about the news, but she tried her best to hide it. I truly thought that her concern was simply that we needed more financial stability before taking such a huge step. I didn't think it was about jealousy or some twisted insecurity. In my mind, it made sense. She always said marriage was something serious and that I should wait for the right moment. So when everything happened so quickly, it was natural for her to be worried. But despite everything, both Need and I were happy. Happy about the pregnancy and the marriage. We got married 2 months before Need's belly was even noticeable. My mother did everything in her power to ensure that I stayed living in the same neighborhood. In fact, it wasn't just the same neighborhood. She managed to secure an apartment in the very same condominium where she lived, 4 floors above us. That made her very happy, and she didn't even ask if we wanted it. Need agreed. When asked if we would prefer another place or if we were looking for something different, she simply said no. My mother just appeared one day saying she had already closed the deal with the landlord. I remember feeling a bit dazed because, in truth, Need and I were searching for a house, not an apartment. We wanted something more spacious, a yard, a place where our child could someday play. But my mother was so excited, saying it would be great to have us close by and that everything was already arranged, even having spoken with the landlord. I ended up giving in. I talked with Need, and she said that maybe it could be nice to live there, at least until we were more established. She agreed, saying that the neighborhood might be nice too, and that it would be pleasant to have my mother nearby. I didn't realize at the time that that apartment 4 floors above was the first step for her to begin completely invading our lives. Months went by, and for a while, everything was fine. The pregnancy went smoothly, the marriage was wonderful, and I truly felt that my life was finally on the right track. My mother was in our home almost every day. Sometimes she would just drop by for coffee. Other times, she would invent some excuse, like bringing some food she had cooked or asking if we needed anything. Because she was so kind with Need, it never became a problem. In fact, Need liked having her around. She never complained. Instead, she often said she was lucky to have such a caring and present mother-in-law. And I noticed that too, which made me very happy. My mother, my wife, and my baby on the way. Nothing made me think that things might change. But everything changed when the baby was born. My mother changed. She changed suddenly. And it was my wife who told me this later, recounting what had happened when I wasn't home. According to my wife, every time she wasn't around, my mother would criticize her for everything. If my wife held the baby in a certain way, my mother would come over to correct her, saying that she didn't know how to hold the baby properly, that the baby needed a firmer grip and could end up slipping. If the baby cried while in Need's arms, my mother would take the child away and say that my wife didn't know how to soothe him and many other things of that sort. I would say that was just my mother's way. She did it out of concern and that she really cared about her. Yet my wife was very upset. She told me that she didn't understand why my mother had changed so abruptly, that she seemed like a completely different person. I didn't spend much time at home anyway. I had to work. So these were things Need told me. Every time she spoke about it, I tried to smooth things over, saying that my mother was only worried and wanted to help. But at the same time, my mother became even more clingy with me. She would always say that the baby looked a lot like me. From when I was little, she'd say that he had my nose, my mouth, even my expression when I was angry, as if he were a mini-me. And then she started coming to our home even more than before. Every day, my wife grew increasingly upset with my mother's behavior. She told me over and over that she didn't want my mother in our house all the time, that she needed space, that she wanted to learn how to be a mother on her own pace, to make mistakes and learn from them. But I said she was being childish, that my mother was helping a lot. As the months passed, the situation began to worsen. My wife complained that my mother had become a harsh, overbearing woman. At first, I thought she was exaggerating. I even began to wonder if she was having some kind of paranoia, because it didn't make sense to me. I couldn't believe that my mother was really being that cruel. But knowing that my wife wasn't lying or crazy, I decided to call my mother aside for a talk. I told her that I was very upset with the way she was treating Need. She looked at me as if I'd said something utterly outrageous, claiming that it was Need who was being overly sensitive, and that Need still had a lot to learn. She even went as far as calling Need ungrateful and fake. She became so upset that she said if I wanted, she wouldn't come to our house anymore. She said that almost in tears. I told her, no, of course, I know it's just a misunderstanding, and everything will go back to normal soon. From my mother's side, it really did seem like Need was ungrateful. So I took my mother's side, spoke with Need again, and begged her, please have a little more patience with my mother. Months passed. Life went on. And although I occasionally noticed a few sharp remarks from my mother, I had grown accustomed to her ways, thinking that she was always like that. So I didn't think it would be too hard to endure. Things weren't perfect, but I was certain that with time, everything would work out. Then I decided to host a dinner at our house. My sister, who no longer lived in the same city, had come to spend some vacation time with her husband and daughter, my niece, whom I hadn't seen in over 3 years. I thought it would be a great idea to gather everyone together. I organized a dinner at our home, but things didn't go exactly as I had imagined. The dinner began well, but soon my mother started with her barbed comments, those remarks that seem harmless at first, but are laced with venom. For instance, she said that Need should start going to the gym, hinting that she was a little overweight. But I just ignored it. Before Need even began eating, the baby started crying, so my wife apologized and went to the bedroom. When my niece finished her portion, she said she was still hungry, and I handed her more food. But again, as soon as she finished, she asked for more. And when I said there was no more food, I put aside my wife's plate in the refrigerator. Shortly after, I went out with my brother-in-law to have a smoke and get some fresh air. While we were talking, I suddenly heard shouting inside the house. When I entered, I saw my wife and my mother yelling at each other. Apparently, when my mother saw that I had put away my wife's plate, she gave my wife her own portion meant for my niece. As I walked in, I heard my mother say, "You can just skip a meal." And then she lightly punched my wife in the stomach. As I moved toward them, I saw my wife spin around and punch my mother in the face, and my mother immediately fell to the ground. The entire house fell silent, except for the sound of my mother crying while clutching her face. I looked at everyone and shouted for all of them to leave my house immediately. Everyone left, except my wife. She remained by the living room counter, her head bowed. I looked at her and said, "You too are leaving now." She raised her head with tear-filled eyes and asked, "Really?" while crying. I replied that yes, she had to leave. She said nothing more, gathered a few of her things along with the babies, and left that night. That very night, I sent her a message apologizing, saying that I just needed space to process what had just happened. She didn't reply. The next day, I woke up already missing her. I was still angry about what she had done to my mother, but I wrote that she could come back home later. Still, she didn't answer my message. When I returned home after work that day, she wasn't there. I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. I sent several messages, and nothing, no response at all. And so it went on for 4 long, agonizing days. With every unanswered message, my anguish grew, and during that time, my mother took the opportunity to speak ill of my wife. She said that I could move back in with her, that Need had never been a proper woman for me, and other such things. At that moment, I understood that my mother only wanted to drive my wife away from me. I wasn't sure if she had orchestrated that fight or not, but if we were fighting, it was her fault. I was going crazy, missing both my wife and my baby. Then, after a week, she appeared. I was hopeful that we could get back together, but I was wrong. She handed me the divorce papers along with custody documents for my baby, and she said very plainly, "Enjoy. You can spend some time with her while I pack my things. Since I'm breastfeeding, we can arrange a visitation schedule." I felt like I was dying inside. I had expected everything except this. I told her that this wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to separate because I loved her so much. I explained that I only needed time to process the fact that she had punched my mother in the face. She looked at me and said, "The fact that you needed time to process has given me time to process as well." And I came to the conclusion that I wanted the divorce. She said that she had only defended herself from my mother, who had been attacking her for months, and that I had never defended her. She claimed that my mother had struck her first, and that I had then kicked her out of our house along with our baby at a time when she needed support. I tried to make her understand why I had done what I did, reminding her of my childhood trauma, the countless times I had seen my mother beaten. That image of my past came flooding back, and it was only for that reason that I reacted the way I did. But it was all in vain. She refused to talk to me for the rest of her time there. She gathered a few of her clothes and left with our daughter. I was completely desperate. I recounted the situation to my mother, and all she had to say was, "See, I told you she was crazy. This strange, overweight woman doesn't belong in our life." Then she even said that I should forget everything and go back to living with her. At that moment, I was certain that she had done it on purpose, that she wanted to keep my wife away from me. I lost it. I turned on my mother and told her that it was her who was crazy, that I would never go back to living with her because I was old enough to have my own life and to move on without her constantly meddling. I was no longer a kid for her to control. She tried to say that she only wanted what was best for me, but I didn't want to hear anything at that moment. I made up my mind that I would win back my wife, that somehow I still had time to fix everything. Twice a week I'd see her, talk for hours, not nearly enough time to really rebuild what was lost, and I tried every way I could to argue that we could still fix everything, that it didn't have to end like this. But nothing helped. Instead, she continued talking about the divorce. Every time we met, she seemed more distant, more determined. She was truly ready to end it all, to throw our relationship away. She kept saying that I had chosen to defend my mother over her, that even though she still loved me, she was so disappointed with how I had handled the situation that she no longer felt comfortable being my partner. That broke me, because I had truly regretted my actions. But how could I fix it when she wouldn't give me a chance to show my remorse? I loved that woman, and I loved my daughter. I couldn't bear to lose them both because of my mother. Desperate for answers, I turned to a fortune teller and asked if there was any way to recover my relationship with Need. I was frantic, unable to accept the separation. I hadn't even cheated on my wife. The fortune teller looked at me and said that she saw a future for us both, but that things were complicated because of a great wound. I began to cry, and then she told me that if I truly wanted her back, I just needed to perform a love-binding spell, a ritual that, according to her, would be very simple, for she could see that there was still love between us. I didn't understand any of that, so I asked her to explain how it worked. She gave me the number of a sorceress and said I should call her as soon as possible because her appointments were booked far in advance, sometimes depending on demand. And so I did. I scheduled a consultation for the following week. The sorceress told me that I would need to bring a piece of clothing from my wife and one of mine, along with photos of our faces. I complied with everything. When I arrived, she cast the bucios and said she saw good things. She said that Need still loved me, and that with the help of an entity, I could have my wife back. She filled me with hope, but then hit me with the price. 5,000 reais. The amount was high, but I was in no position to question anything. I just wanted my Need back. Later that week, I gathered everything required, and she assured me that she would perform a very strong binding spell that would succeed within, at most, 1 month. To be honest, by the second week, I noticed remarkable changes. Need said she missed me, and that the baby did too. Gradually, we began to get closer again until we eventually reunited. She told me that she loved me and couldn't stand to be apart from me, that she was willing to overcome everything, but she made it clear that she never wanted my mother in our home again. I reassured her that she could rest easy, that I had already put my mother in her proper place. Now I knew very well that my mother was manipulative. Finally, I managed to get my wife and my daughter back, and that was all that mattered to me. I don't believe that the spell will ever turn against me because the love was already there. It only helped erase the foolishness I had committed. After that, of course, my mother called me in a state of panic, insisting that I should separate from Need because she was a crazy, strange, overweight woman. But I told her that she no longer had any right to meddle in my life, and I continued on my path with my wife and daughter. I still speak with my mother. I still see her, but not as closely as before. No, that will never happen again.